Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all of you to this CIF debate. Today, as you know, we will discuss the limits of self-regulation in tackling harmful content with examples from the Code of Practice on Disinformation and the Code of Conduct on Countering Illegal Hate Speech Online. Today's debate is hosted by the IF member, Tiemo Wölken, who is an MEP with the S&D Group, a member of the jury committee. And as you know, MEP Wölken has worked both on the DSA and the DMA, and in particular as rapporteur for initiative report on the DSA and shadow rapporteur on DSA opinion in the jury committee, rapporteur for the opinion on the digital markets proposal. Thank you very much, Tiemo. Welcome. Thanks for taking the lead on this topic at our forum. I will leave you the floor in a moment, but before I do so, I will introduce our panelists who will tell us more about the challenges of self-regulatory approach when it comes to tackling harmful content online. A warm welcome to Marco Pancini, Government Affairs and Public Policy Director for Europe at YouTube. Welcome, Marco. We are also joined by Lisa Ginsborg, who is acting Secretary General at the European Digital Media Observatory, and by Gina Nieri, who is member of the European Commission's high-level expert group on fake news and a board member of Mediaset, the largest commercial broadcaster in Italy. We're also joined by Carlos Hernández-Echevarría, Head of Public Policy and Institutional Development at Maldita.es, a non-profit media outlet and independent fact-checker in Spain. Last but not least, welcome to Daniel Braun, who's Deputy Head of Cabinet at European Commission Vice President Jourova. Thank you all very much for joining us. Now, with no further ado, I will leave the floor to our hosting MEP for his opening remarks. We will then listen to all our guest speakers, and then, as usual, a Q&A session will follow with participants. So be ready with your questions for later. Tiemo Wölken.
Thank you very much, Maria, for allowing me to speak and for allowing me to have the privilege to host this debate today, which I must say is really, really interesting from the title. And looking at the panel, I'm hoping for a very lively debate today. So I think before we start, I just want to say a few words about the topic itself. I want first to take a moment and thank the team of the European Internet Forum for organizing this event, of course, today. And I also would like to thank our speakers for being here with us. As I said, I really believe we have a great panel with people from different backgrounds with us today. So we are sure to have a very lively debate and different viewpoints. And as I said, I'm hoping for a lively debate, and I just can't avoid this. I want to borrow from the platform lingo. I hope to burst a few filter bubbles today. So back to the topic. As you all know, we are still quite intensively discussing the Digital Services Act in the European Parliament. And as it is also common knowledge, it's quite a controversial file. So with many different and clashing priorities, I have witnessed it myself in the negotiations in jury. Heart of the debate are the content moderation practices that platforms have to implement. We are debating a lot about how, when, and if platforms should have to take down illegal content. But we are not talking enough about how we are going to tackle fringe content like disinformation, harmful content, and other material that might indeed not be illegal, but clearly still has a negative impact. So far, the main solution proposed to this issue has been the introduction of voluntary codes of conduct that companies sign on to and enforce themselves via their terms and conditions. But those instruments have their limits. So firstly, the Commission designs the code in collaboration with companies that sign up to them, But at no stage, for example, the European Parliament is involved in the process. So codes of conduct thus lack, from my point of view, the legitimacy that only a democratically elected body can provide in our legal order. And one of my first assignments during my law studies was indeed to assess the function of soft law measures, where you clearly can see the code of conduct. And I think I'm not revealing a secret. I have a very critical view on that. So just to let you know. So again, this is all the more important since a code of conduct on issues like disinformation and harmful content directly touch upon the fundamental rights of citizens online. And secondly, we indeed see a huge gap in enforcement and implementation of code of conducts in Europe, even between different member states. So when we look at the code of practice on disinformation, for instance, Facebook took action against 80% of fact-checked COVID-19 content in Spain in 2021, but only against 16% in Italy. So the gap between these numbers is clearly completely unacceptable, and it highlights the need to rethink enforcement of code of conduct. And sorry, maybe I'm getting too long, but remembering or recalling what Frances Haugen said during her hearing, she clearly made the point that Facebook does not invest in all languages equally. So there are languages they can enforce better, and there are areas or countries where they do a better job on enforcement. And I think these numbers prove it. So at the same time, I believe we need to be very careful when regulating harmful content. So by definition, harmful content is fringe content. It often sits right at the border of what is legal and what is illegal content. So this makes any binding rules, of course, very sensitive. We should not, we should not fall into the trap and limit fundamental rights like the freedom of expression out of fear of harmful content. Sticking to the example of disinformation, I believe it is important that we safeguard the right for everyone to speak freely, even if not all of their information might be accurate. A society that finds it acceptable to take down legal pieces of content only based on criteria of quality or accuracy of information practices nothing else than kind of censorship. So what is true for the individual, however, is not always true for large organizations. Organized disinformation outlets are a huge problem. And I believe more action is warranted against their attempts to manipulate our democratic debate and to purposefully spread disinformation. So I'm happy that the Commission has also recognized this issue and will be tackling it with its Media Freedom Act, on which Vice President Jourova and Commissioner Breton shared new information only yesterday. And I'm coming to an end. I could go on and on, but I don't want to take any more time from our debate, and I'm looking indeed forward to hearing our panelists' take on all these issues. And let me just conclude with this. I believe that codes of conduct can be a powerful tool to tackle things like disinformation, but they should never replace and can never replace hard law, which was adopted through a democratic process. So as lawmakers, we cannot shy away from our responsibility because regulating on an issue like disinformation is uncomfortable. So also putting some self-criticism here, we should not only say, okay, we can't do it, someone else has to do it. We have to take over responsibility.
Thank you very much, Timo, for setting the scene. This is definitely a thorny issue, and the task that policymakers like you have is definitely not an easy one. We will now listen to various views from stakeholders, starting with Marco Pancini with YouTube.
I apologize for the technical issue. It shows once again that even if half of the world is now online and the use of technology is leaping forward, we still have some connection problem also in the middle of Brussels and in the office of a tech company. So, but once again, like the digital acceleration is not being without challenges. And of course, misinformation is a stubborn problem both online and offline that we are facing at the moment. We know that Google and YouTube have a responsibility in this fight, in the overall fight against harmful content, and we are determined to be part of the solution. Every day, millions of people access to our services for high quality information. So, and verify things they have heard elsewhere and learn more about the world. But what's also true is that filtering out issues like disinformation and misinformation isn't something that we can do alone. That's why we are working in collaboration with partners in every country to innovate and create ways to counteract fake news online, covering everything from 5G to national security to COVID-19. So let me describe quickly the two pillars of our strategy against misinformation. First, the possible solution of the problem is not just what we take down, but how we treat all the content that we leave up, and they give us the best path forward, actually working on that. Misinformation has moved from the marginal to the mainstream, and now stretch into every facet of our society. YouTube reflects the world around us, and that's why we've made stopping the spread of misinformation one of our deepest commitments. So we have took some action. First, we have been removing content as quickly as possible since the beginning of YouTube through our community guidelines. Our policies center on the removal of any videos that can directly lead to egregious real-world harm, so including harmful content. Today, we remove between 6 to 10 millions of videos a quarter, and the majority of which don't even reach 10 views across all the jurisdiction, all the countries where we are present. Other point, speedy removals will always be important, but we know that they are not nearly enough. The content that we are leaving up on YouTube give us a way to tackle issues like disinformation. So it's always a balance, as Tiemo said, between overly removing content and free speech. An overly aggressive approach towards removals, for example, would have also a chilling effect on free speech. Also because removals are a blunt instrument, and if used too widely, can send a message that controversial ideas are unacceptable, which is something that we don't want to happen. So our support for an open platform means also an ever greater accountability to connect people with quality information, which brings me to the second point, our second pillar. The most important thing we can do is increase the good and decrease the bad. At YouTube, we are raising up information from trusted sources and reducing the spread of videos with harmful misinformation. Let me give you a couple of examples. When people now search for news or information, they get a result optimized for quality, not for how sensational the content may be. If we take COVID as a second example, we rely on expert consensus, from health authorities to track the science as it develops, to also fact checkers. And in most of the cases, misinformation is less clear-cut. So collaboration is key to success in the fight for quality information, and for many years we have invested in products and partnership to fight disinformation. But now let me talk about our initiative together with the other stakeholders in, I would call it co-regulating these issues more than self-regulating. In 2018, we signed the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation, and now we are working hard with the other signatories. Today we have some of them on updating the code to make it more robust, impactful, and ready to address the current challenges, because we are proud of what we achieved. Like, for example, all the work that we have done during the European elections, all the work that we have done as a signatories party during the COVID-19 crisis. But we believe that we can go further. That's why we are also contributing 25 million to launch the European News and Information Fund, set up by the European University Institute and the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation under the supervision of the European Digital Media Observatory. The goal of this initiative is to strengthen fact-checking, media literacy, research, and disinformation. Another example, we complemented this investment with our Google News initiatives, which has provided verification training to more than 90,000 journalists across the world. And we are supporting fact-checking initiatives such as Fact and Check 21st in Germany, and a partnership with the German press agency, DPA, just as an example. Finally, recently we launched the Safety Engineering Center for Content Responsibility in Dublin. Unlikely only on a virtual basis because of the COVID restriction, but soon we really hope that we're gonna host in this regional hub for experts, stakeholders that are interested about the way we tackle illegal and harmful content. And the goal is really to engage with the regulators through in the context of our center, emphasizing openness, transparency, and our shared vision. So to conclude, the challenge we face is significant, but by using reputable research, best practice, and working together with experts, we are finding new and innovative ways to fight disinformation and harmful content. And we strive to stay true to our mission to give everyone a voice and show them the world. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Marco, for sharing these examples of co-regulatory approach as you specified. I will now give eventually the floor to Lisa Ginsborg with the European Digital Media Observatory.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosa, and thank you very much for this kind invitation to EDMO to join this fascinating debate. So my presentation is going to focus on the limits of self-regulation in tackling harmful content, with a particular focus on the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation, which forms a key part of EDMO's focus and work. So it is clear that in domains with extremely high rate of technological development as online disinformation, it is increasingly difficult to create top-down regulation that is sufficiently effective and future-proof. But at the same time, it is also clear that private actors are well placed to provide fast and effective solutions in specific fields like digital media by bringing knowledge, expertise, and information into the regulatory process. However, a number of risks, including lack of transparency, accountability, and information asymmetries, call for caution and specific checks and balances to be envisaged, while allowing for flexibility and evaluation. So focusing a bit on the code of practice on online disinformation, which has been already mentioned by Marco Pancini, I would start by saying that the code of practice represented a natural and very important first step. And very important action has been taken under the code of practice, as was seen also in relation to COVID-19 in the reporting system, which was set up under the code of practice. Thanks also to the flexibility and the speed available in this self-regulatory instrument. So although the topic of today's debate is on the limits of self-regulation, I would like to start by saying that the code of practice, of course, has achieved a lot of important steps in the fight against disinformation. However, my presentation is going to focus on the limits, and a lot of the limits have already been discussed at length by policymakers, by the European Commission, by ERGA. In particular, when the code of practice was established, it already had a number of limits in its original version. So there was somewhat limited stakeholder involvement, including the lack of involvement of traditional media and other platforms, creating the potential of a regulatory asymmetry between code signatories and non-signatories. There was a clear lack of unified definitions, and perhaps a need for a broader definition of manipulative behavior to include, for instance, the involvement of influencers in this area. In certain areas, perhaps there was a lack of safeguards to prevent over-compliance and ensure respect for fundamental human rights. But in particular, going forward, a number of problems have emerged in the implementation of the code of practice, which have been highlighted, as I mentioned, both by the European Commission and by ERGA. And these have included the lack of commonly shared definitions, clearer procedures, and more precise and comprehensive commitments. The absence of meaningful KPIs to assess the effectiveness of platforms' policies to counter the phenomenon, the lack of access to data allowing for an independent evaluation of emerging trends and threats posed by online disinformation and appropriate monitoring. And at present, it remains quite difficult to assess the signatories' actions, as public authorities are still very much reliant, in the view of ERGA, on the willingness of platforms to share information of data. Another limitation that was noted in the reporting was the lack of more granular data, in particular at country level. Some areas of the code have obviously been better implemented than others. So one area which is of particular concern for EDMO has been the access to data for researchers, which is one of the pillars of the code, one of the core areas of the code, and this still remains an area which needs to see further development, let's say. And more generally, also during the COVID reporting, significant steps were taken by platform, and a number of, let's say, shortcomings were noticed also by EDMO, including the lack of standardized reporting, lack of clarity about geographical scope, audience reach, and temporal scope, a lack of clarity about content categories, and more generally a need for meaningful quantitative data oriented to comparable benchmarks and regularly made available at different aggregate levels. So these are a number of shortcomings that have been noticed in the current code. And the most significant of all, of course, is the area of lack of independent oversight and independent auditing. So although the code did originally envisage a system, this never really came into action. And the guidance that has been issued by the European Commission on revising the code of practice goes a long way towards improving the code in a number of areas, including this area. So including with regard to independent oversight, expanded commitments, and also the issue of access to data. So EDMO looks forward to play a part in this process of revision of the code. I think it has been recognized that many of the limitations of the code come precisely from its self-regulatory nature. But the guidance aims at evolving this code towards a co-regulatory instrument, as is foreseen in the Digital Services Act, offering the opportunity to design appropriate measures to address systemic risks related to disinformation and stemming from the functioning and use made of platform services in view of the anticipated DSA risk assessment and mitigation framework. So it is clear that the DSA aims to combine the flexibility of industry-based solutions with this key role for independent oversight. But of course, this move to co-regulation to the DSA will take time. So I would say it is essential that in the meantime, the code of practice is strengthened through the process, which was already mentioned by Marco, of this revision of the code, which is already ongoing. And there is hope that many of the problems that I have noted could be solved even before the DSA comes into practice, into existence. Will all these problems be solved in the DSA? This is a big question, and of course I don't have time to answer it here in detail. I would say some, hopefully yes, including this question of providing the teeth, let's say, the focus on auditing as well as transparency obligation is key and promises to go a long way towards solving some of the problems in this self-regulatory instrument. Some may be, so it remains to be seen. So the DSA does not shed much light on what platforms should actually do to mitigate risks emerging from disinformation. So a number of key issues remain to be clarified to avoid too much discretion being left to online platforms and provide a strong legal basis for independent oversight, in particular with regard to the principles for content moderation, responsible algorithmic design, as well as the demonetization of websites. And finally, some perhaps know, in the sense that the DSA will not, of course, be able to solve everything. It is not a silver bullet. No silver bullet exists in the fight against online disinformation. And this is very much goes to the heart of the approach of EDMO, which combines the recognitions of the importance of these self and co-regulatory measures with broader approaches with user empowerment, including through fact-checking, media literacy initiatives, which will of course only become more important going forward. And the greater transparency and accountability as envisaged in the DSA, and the greater understanding of disinformation phenomenon through the access to data, the more appropriate and effective these multi-stakeholder approaches will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for sharing your views and insights, and for bringing us through all the limits of the code that you have identified. And you have raised, I think, the biggest question of all, and that we will ask all our speakers today. Now, I would like to give the floor to Gina Nieri with Mediaset.
Thank you very much. I wish to thank the European Internet Forum for organizing this timing debate, as well as the media sector for supporting my intervention. Thank you. As representative of Europe's media, comprising both commercial and public broadcaster, broadcaster and public broadcaster, we welcome the institutional engagement on this crucial matter, because it's one of the very, very important items that in the European Commission we have to face. When we started discussing this topic in the context of the high-level group of fake news back in 2018, it was already clear that some of us, as the whistleblower Francis Hogan reminded us a few days ago, profits were prioritized over safety. We know that misinformation and plain disinformation have been fabricated, promoted, and targeted exactly for the sake of profit. There is anything casual. Everything was exactly built to diffuse click, to have the more audience possible, and to receive money. Also, the algorithms are exactly built to multiply the click on disinformation. Unfortunately, the code of practice, in our opinion, fails to deliver meaningful result in terms of commitment and KPIs. It's sad to say, but it was a baby step in the right direction, which must now be reinforced with binding obligation within the DSA. The detrimental impact on our democracy is now evident, and the COVID vaccine disinformation is just one of the many examples I could raise. It also creates an unfair competition for media organizations who directly compete with online platforms. This unbalanced competition is a problem, because we as a broadcaster, we as a media organization that are the information and the transparencies of information as the information that is responsible, because there is somebody who responds for what we are broadcasting. We are under pressure, because this amount of money that is taken from this way to diffuse this kind of content is something that put on pressure our balance sheet, and the result is that our company that are exactly the interpreter of the European Commission value, the human rights, the diversity of content, the national and European employment are under pressure exactly because there is this totally unruled competition. And due to the effort carried out by broadcasters to counter online information, viewers during the last period, the period of COVID, have increased their trust in TV news. Because, for example, in Spain, a recently published study showed that more than 5.2% of the population consider TV the first, 52% consider the TV news, they increase their trust in TV news. And the population is considered TV the first and most reliable source of certified information. On the contrary, social media networks and video sharing platforms rank last with respectively 6.8 and 4.2. And the same in Italy. There is another research that is putting exactly the focus on the result of audience, and our news had an audience of 60%, and the most important thing is that there is a sort of comeback to this news by young generation. And for example, the news on Facebook are 30%. This is a signal that there is a perception of the possibility to find a place in which there is not disinformation, but information. Due to the effort carried out by broadcaster, we have the possibility to counter disinformation. But it's impossible to think that the only possibility is self-regulation. Because when I was exactly in this context of the high-level group, the reaction when we are pushing for an assumption of responsibility, the reply of Facebook, Google was, we don't want to be the ministry of truth. Nobody's asking for this. Everybody was asking for a right behavior and exactly to be responsible for what is the approach for the information. There is another problem. For example, at present, the platform arbitrarily decide what can be on their services, providing very little information about the motivation to users. Changes in this term of service and the listing of publishers' content made available by legitimate right owners are not absolutely explained. And this is something that creates severe economic damage to business users, which rely on these services for visibility and reach. As broadcaster, the content we distribute both online and offline is strictly regulated by national and EU law. However, platforms can unilaterally demote publisher content and thereby exercise editorial control with the established procedure. Sometimes they are responsible, sometimes no. There is something wrong. In this context, we have welcomed the Digital Service Act package and call on co-legislators to strengthen the provision of both texts to ensure a safe and pro-competitive online environment for both user and business player. Specifically on DSA, we regret the attempt to weaken the current reliability regime and call on co-legislator to adopt ambitious provisions which would also comprise adequate safeguard for content uploaded by editorially responsible organization. In addition, the review code of practice, legally binding via the DSA provisions, should have clear commitments and verifiable KPIs. We also welcome the proposal of political advertising. However, its provisions still leave a wide gap between the rules applying to media organization, which in Italy impose, for example, a total ban for political advertising on television, and what should eventually apply to online platform. The need is to go through something more committed for the platform, because self-regulation at the end of the day is very, very weak to solve the problem. It's impossible perhaps to solve the problem, but we really are convinced that a binding rule is exactly what will solve the problem, because we are completely ruled, but our editorial role is not curbed by this. We are free to diffuse our news under a lot of law, but it's possible to be free in this regime ruled. We have not, I don't know why this platform has to refuse completely ruled. Self-ruled are very simple, but what happened is demonstrating that also the platform need to be ruled in a very, very severe way for the freedom of everybody, first of all for our citizen. To conclude, we thank the EU institution for the work that they are carrying out, and we are ready, of course, to continue to exchange with the Parliament, the Commission, to work in the direction that our democratic values are effectively protected by online and offline. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gina. I think your message was very clear, and thanks for sharing your views as a representative of the TV broadcasters, but also as a member of the expert group on fake news. We will now hear from Carlos Hernández-Echevarría, Head of Public Policy and Institutional Development at Maldita.es.
Hello, and thanks to EIF and to Mr. Wölken for hosting us today. As many of you already know, Maldita is one of the biggest fact checkers in Europe, and we are also a brand new prospective signatory of the Code of Practice on Disinformation. I'm going to start with a few things, because then I'm going to go quite negative about self-regulation, but I want to start, giving some credit at the beginning, that having kind of not so effective self-regulatory instrument has been way better than not having anything in place. So I think, credit where credit's due. The efforts of 2018 were, there are shortcomings, but it's also, there's also an advance, and the fact that we are here discussing this is further proof of that. I'm also not in general opposed to this kind of self-regulatory efforts, particularly in the field of disinformation, if only for the capacity to have an updated toolbox against disinformation. I mean, we have had a directive before DSA that mainly regulated the internet in Europe, if you want to call it like that, like oversimplifying, for the last 20 years. We very rarely are going to have the capacity to wait 20 years for anything. We are going to need some other things being done at much more expedient, and that can come from self-regulatory efforts such as the code. So in that sense, when I think about the limits of self-regulation, I find myself aligned not only with my own judgment as a fact checker, but also with the shortcomings that the European Commission itself identified when evaluating the code. I mean, the code has been, as I said, great as a first step. I'm going to take the words of Lisa because I agree with them. It was a great first step, but self-regulation has inherent problems. The first one is that it's obviously voluntary. So I took issue with Marco's and YouTube's views on many things, but I certainly appreciate that Marco and YouTube are sitting at that table, because all the platforms that have big roles in disseminating disinformation are not even there. They are not even answering the calls to grab a seat. So that's important. But at the same time, it's difficult to overlook that there are serious shortcomings at the experience we have more at hand in this code. The voluntary issue is very important. Access to data is everything. It's very hard to measure something without the proper KPIs, the kind of data access, because this is a conversation that always revolves around transparency. And I think there has been some advance in transparency, but how meaningful that transparency has been, if we take the example of the COVID reports from signatories. Well, really very little. Those, journal figures thrown around about so many contents or posts deleted, they really tell very little of the story we want to understand when we talk about disinformation online. So we need to get into specifics, and I think that the whole strengthening process that is being done right now should go in that direction. When it comes to self-regulation against disinformation, the most important thing is specificity. Is what I think we have learned through the years, like detailed commitments, clear measurements, because otherwise it's impossible to monitor compliance, and then we end up with good words, good intentions, very little meaningful actions. And I'm going to talk a little about actions in the sense that I think it's a terrible mistake if we frame this conversation about having only two options to fight disinformation online once you have identified it. Like you can delete this or you can leave it alone. No. That's a false dichotomy that ends up permeating the whole conversation, and it's just not like that. If you ask fact checkers around the world, and we deal on a daily basis with the final form of disinformation, with the contents that end up in the cell phone of our audience, you will find that very few fact checkers, if any, will say, no, the solution is deleting disinformation, even the disinformation we flag as disinformation. We think, and we think we have the academic knowledge on our side in this, that it's much more useful for that content to remain online, even if it's disinformation, but of course with the proper labeling, with the quality explanation that it needs. I mean, when you delete something from a platform, most of the times, obviously there are things that are crude violence or child pornography, those things have no place wherever. But most disinformation is not to our benefit to delete it. It is to our benefit as a society to provide more information instead of less information, which is deleting. I mean, if I see that video with thousands of views that says that it's good for you to drink bleach against COVID, if you delete it, that's gonna come with accusations of censorship. That's gonna create some vacuums that some users are gonna feel threatened by it. But if that video remains online, but we make sure, superimposed to that video, you can see a clear label that says 7 medical societies are saying the content of this video can be dangerous to your health. That is much more powerful and much more effective than deleting it. So I would like this whole policy conversation about self-regulation to be, to be structured about deleting or not. In the end, much of this conversation should be about, as we were saying, transparency, but meaningful transparency. Transparency with data access. Transparency in terms of not so many contents have been flagged as disinformation, but I'm more interested in how people interacted with that. How many of them got to see some quality information afterwards? I mean, of the people who saw the hoax, how many of them saw the debunk? How many of them clicked on the link? How many of them shared that content? How many of those contents were promoted as paid advertising? There are so many things that we do not know. And I certainly think, and I always give the benefit of the doubt to everyone and to platforms in particular, because I don't think, even if you have to take business models into account when having this conversation, I don't think any platform wants to be a dumpster where everything is false and the user experience is terrible because you are being lied all the time. I don't think they want that. But sometimes they have, I would say, politely trouble finding help, or they think they can do everything by themselves. And some of the platforms have said that exactly, like this, we cannot address it alone. But self-regulation really, I think, has a very important role in this, not only because it's more easily updated, also because, as we have been saying, illicit content that is going to be at the core of DSA, it's one thing, but there are many other things, as Mr. Wölken was saying, that are clearly, objectively, commonly shared as being very harmful and that are just not illicit. And for those contents, the best response, in the experience of fact checkers, in the academic research of the last few years, is to provide those users with more information about why are they being lied to, what's the real fact-based information about this issue they have been reading upon, why they have been targeted that way, why, if I'm a 30 to 40 Spanish guy living in a big city, I am seeing this kind of content and not this other kind of content, why I'm seeing this 2 weeks before the election and not the week before the election, that kind of thing. So I think self-regulation has a role here precisely because the kind of table we envision to address this issue needs to be very wide. It needs to include a lot of people. Hard regulation is hard to come. It's hard to update once the things are changing and things change a lot in the internet. So I think self-regulation is more flexible in that way, and it includes more people, and it gives sometimes more credibility because more people is involved. Third sector, academics, fact checkers, platforms, of course, and even regulators, as could be ERGA. So that could be it. I'm really dying to hear the questions, but that would be my thing. I think the self-regulation example we have had in Europe in the form of the Code of Practice of Disinformation, it's been successful as a first step. It brought some people into a room, and those people really deserve credit because they have been doing efforts. those efforts have come short. And I think for no other particular views, everybody can consult the evaluation the commission itself did, and I think it's pretty on point on that. It's a good first experience, but it needs to be very much strengthened. Thank you, everyone, and thank you especially to all the speakers that went before me.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your contribution and for providing some suggestions for concrete solutions. Now we will listen to Daniel Braun with the Cabinet of Vice President Jourova.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Wölken and EIF for inviting me. I have to admit that it was a bit gratifying to see that even big tech has connection issues. And it's difficult to come last. My co-panelist, I have to say, said basically everything I wanted to say. So let me take a step back and mention a few specific points on how I see the evolution and develop a few aspects based on my experience of working intensively on the guidance to strengthen the code of practice in the past months. And as a backdrop and stating the obvious where we come from, the Commission supports digital transformation, but in a way that maximizes the advantages to users, to businesses, to society, respecting values, rights, and laws. And this is not easy. I mean, it's all a fast evolving area. We are also in a very sensitive ground in terms of conflicting interests at the limit of many fundamental rights. And there's a deep connection between what's happening in the society and what's happening online. And what is special, as was said, is the speed of reach, the amplification driven by the engagement. And COVID conspiracies can reach millions in a few seconds. Opaque methods can influence elections, so that this can hurt people, this can hurt democracies. And more generally, the platforms have obtained a role in our society that enables to take decisions for anyone, whether we see products, whether we have a chance to influence the information that is shown to us or not shown to us, and bad actors who exploit this environment for political goals, but also with economic incentives. And it's clear that the regulatory framework, that directive from 20 years ago, is simply not fit for purpose. With the many new business models, also associated risks have arisen. So we need to rebalance this relationship between platforms and users, authorities, and to make sure that the rules are defined in the public interest with democratic legitimacy, which is legislation. But yes, as was described by my co-panelists, we have experience in working with platforms to address hate speech and disinformation. I worked in 2016 on the code of conduct on hate speech, and I really want to acknowledge the progress, and Marco will remember that at first we were really discussing even the basic concepts, like having capacities to assess notifications also against the law, not only against the terms of services, having some target time frame to do that. And the initial removal rates for the cases of illegal hate speech were really terrible, I have to say, immediately after the code. And some problems remain, and Mr. Wölken, I think, mentioned a very crucial issue of unequal treatment of languages, where we see possible links to low vaccination rates in Bulgaria and Romania, I think. But all in all, I'd say the codes were important steps with good results, bringing cooperation of platforms with civil society, faster takedowns. Now 90% of notifications of illegal hate speech are assessed in 24 hours. So that's good. And what we now did in a way was to make binding the good elements and introduced a set of due diligence obligations for digital service providers so that they actively mitigate the risks associated with the services through the DSA, but also through the codes that are actually foreseen in the DSA as tools that are flexible for emerging phenomena. And for things like disinformation, we believe that design-led solutions in Europe, I think we believe that design-led solutions are more useful than removal obligations. And so codes, I would say, should continue to play a role. And here it's very different from illegal content, obviously, on disinformation. We can't legislatively restrict access to content on the basis of truthfulness only. So that's why this risk approach by the industry is so important. And the question is how to combine the advantages with the limits of self-regulation, the lacking due process, the lacking transparency, no consequences of inaction also. And that's why we presented what we call internally really a digital rule book that consisted of the DSA, DMA, but also the European Democracy Action Plan, where we link the codes to compliance with legislation through putting this risk mitigation into a regulatory framework. And that is why we're working with platforms and others on strengthening the code with concrete commitments indeed, and with a monitoring framework, operationalizing the concepts of risk mitigation. In other words, this is the co-regulatory approach where the Commission is checking the objectives so that it can be part of assessing the DSA obligations. But of course, this will only work if it's a strong instrument, if it respects our guidance to cover the gaps, to broaden the participation, and bringing oversight and data access. And Carlos mentioned the direction very well on meaningful transparency, looking at engagements and such KPIs. And for me, besides this risk mitigating factor and the legal obligation, the word code actually implies that it should also create some sort of an industry-wide minimum standards upfront to reduce the externalities and keep users safe, like the architecture code. So one could call it, I think, putting CSR into the information space in a way. And that leads me to my final point to echo Lisa. I think that indeed one of the lessons of the past years is that there are no magical solutions. We need to adopt a mindset that any countermeasures will only solve part of the issues, which are really many, from information aggressors to tribal information environment with unhealthy incentives within the system. And we need many different actions applied simultaneously, a collaborative effort. I believe personally that EDMO can play a very important role in strengthening the demand side. The media are a crucial actor to navigate the online environment. And we're working to protect the sector in many ways, as Mr. Wölken will know very well. And a key part of these efforts is increasing the accountability of digital players and having enforceable obligations. I think that's the cornerstone. So basically, I'd say that with hard law and effective multi-stakeholder cooperation to protect the society, I believe we can reassert the integrity of the digital space to a large extent. But everything has been said, so I'd stop here and happy to develop on the specific points and aspects of the links. Thank you.